What if everything you knew, everything you loved, was taken from you in the blink of an eye? Sophie stood in front of the doctor, the sterile white walls of the clinic echoing the silence between them. Her heart raced, blood pounding in her ears, as she tried to process the words that had just been spoken. "You have terminal cancer," the doctor said, his voice low, almost as if he were trying to soften the blow. "We estimate only a few weeks left." Sophie blinked, her mind refusing to grasp the gravity of his statement. The words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating her. Terminal cancer. A few weeks left. She tried to focus on the doctor's face, but everything blurred into one incomprehensible mess. She hadn't been feeling well for a while, tired, aching, a bit nauseous here and there, but she hadn't thought much of it. Whoever does. Sophie had been busy living her life, ticking off to-do lists, running from one meeting to the next, catching up with friends, and barely slowing down to breathe. She'd even convinced herself that all of the fatigue was just stress from her job at a corporate firm in New York City. Stress she could handle. But this? This was something else entirely. Sophie opened her mouth to say something, anything, but her throat was dry, and the words didn't come. The room felt smaller with each passing second, the weight of what she had just heard sinking deeper into her chest. The doctor's voice continued, but it sounded distant now. "We can offer treatment options," but his voice trailed off, and Sophie didn't need him to finish. The end was near, and she could feel it settling in like a shadow creeping across the floor. How does anyone respond to that? The question hung in the air, and Sophie wondered how people like her, people who were just living, just trying to get through the days, react to something so definitive. What was she supposed to do now? How was she supposed to process the idea of dying, knowing there wasn't enough time to fix all the things she hadn't done? Her mind spun as the doctor continued his explanation of treatments she didn't care to hear. The tears began to sting her eyes, but Sophie fought them back. She refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of him. Instead, she stood up and nodded absent-mindedly, as if to signal that she understood, that she would think about the options. But inside, all Sophie could hear was the constant thrum of a single, terrifying thought. What now? The drive home was a blur. Sophie didn't even remember leaving the doctor's office. It was as though the world around her had frozen, and she was walking through it in slow motion. Cars passed her on the highway, their drivers oblivious to the woman sitting in her car, fighting back waves of panic. The city she had spent so many years building a life in felt distant, foreign, as if it didn't belong to her anymore. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her back into reality. It was a message from Emma, her best friend. "How's everything going? Miss you." Sophie stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to tell Emma everything, wanted to pick up the phone and scream, "I don't know what to do. I'm dying. Please help me." But the words wouldn't come. How could she tell Emma something so final? How could she explain a reality that she herself didn't fully understand? Instead, Sophie typed back a quick, half-hearted message. "I'm fine. Just a little tired. I'll call you later." She didn't hit send. The words felt empty, hollow, a lie. She couldn't explain this. Not yet, at least. Maybe she didn't even want to. She parked her car in front of her apartment building, the familiar skyline of New York stretching out before her. The city that never slept. But Sophie felt like she had just woken up into someone else's life. Everything she thought she knew, everything she took for granted, was suddenly so fragile, so fleeting. Sophie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself before heading inside. Her apartment was quiet when she walked through the door. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the click of the hallway light, the rustling of paper from the unopened mail on the kitchen counter, it all seemed so ordinary, so unaffected by the monumental shift she had just experienced. Sophie dropped her keys on the counter and walked into the living room, slumping onto the couch. The soft cushions swallowed her whole, but the comfort was short-lived. Her mind was racing, thoughts colliding and crashing into each other, none of them making any sense. What was she supposed to do with the little time she had left? She reached for her phone again, staring at Emma's message, but then something stopped her. She couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. She couldn't keep lying to herself or to the people she loved. Sophie knew she had to face it. Death is coming. And I have no idea what to do with it. She took another deep breath, letting it out slowly, trying to center herself. Her mind kept returning to a question that had been circling her brain ever since the doctor's words rang out. What would you do if you knew you had only a few weeks left to live? She didn't know. Not yet. But somehow, in the back of her mind, Sophie felt a pull toward something. A desire to do something, anything, to make the time she had left count. A yearning to do more than just sit idly by, waiting for the inevitable. She had lived her life on autopilot for far too long. But now, the time for autopilot was over. Now, she had to choose. But how? Sophie leaned back on the couch, staring out the window, the lights of the city twinkling in the distance. Maybe she didn't have the answers yet. But she was going to figure it out. And maybe it started with something small. Maybe it started with a simple question. What would you do if you knew you had only a few weeks left to live? The thought echoed in her mind, the uncertainty lingering. Sophie didn't have an answer yet, but she knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Sophie's life hadn't always been this way. She hadn't always been a woman with a terminal diagnosis, pacing through her apartment in search of meaning. She hadn't always spent her nights wrestling with thoughts of time running out. Before all of this, before the doctor's words shattered her, Sophie had been a different person. She had been someone who believed in controlling her destiny, who had a plan for everything. But now, as she sat quietly on the couch, waiting for something to shift within her, she couldn't help but wonder where it all went wrong. Born and raised in a quiet suburb of New Jersey, Sophie was the only child of Christine and Robert Reynolds. Her childhood home was a place of modest comforts. There were no grand family vacations or extravagant celebrations, but it was a home filled with love. Sophie's mother, Christine, was warm and nurturing, always there to listen and offer support. Sophie's father, Robert, on the other hand, was more distant, a lawyer who worked long hours, always striving for perfection and instilling in Sophie the same drive to succeed. Good enough is never enough, Robert would say, his voice stern as he adjusted his tie before heading out the door. He didn't mean to sound harsh. It was simply his way of pushing Sophie to be her best. Yet, for Sophie, it often felt like an unspoken pressure, a weight she carried into her adult life. As a child, Sophie had been eager to please, to meet her father's high expectations. Her schoolwork was always flawless, her room impeccably clean, and every task she was given completed with precision. But there was a quiet ache in her heart, an emptiness that stemmed from the one thing she could never seem to get right, her father's affection. Christine, on the other hand, had always been the softer presence in Sophie's life. She would sit with Sophie at the kitchen table, offering tea as they talked about everything under the sun. They shared an emotional connection that Sophie cherished. Her mother was her safe place, her rock. But Sophie could never quite shake the feeling that she was living for her father's approval. She could never escape the need to be perfect, to meet standards that seemed to always be just out of reach. When Sophie was 15, her life changed forever. It wasn't a dramatic shift, at least not on the surface. But the death of her first love, Ethan, left a permanent scar. Ethan had been a year older, a charming, carefree teenager with a knack for making people laugh. Sophie had met him during the summer before high school, and in the span of a few months, she had fallen deeply in love with him. They shared stolen moments, laughter-filled days, and dreams of a future together. But on one rainy night in late September, Ethan's car collided with a truck, and just like that, he was gone. The grief was unlike anything Sophie had ever known. She had never been taught how to process loss, never been shown how to navigate the gaping hole left by someone you loved. The night after the funeral, Sophie cried herself to sleep, staring at the ceiling and wondering how someone so full of life could simply vanish. Her mother had tried to comfort her, but Christine didn't know how to fix something so broken. Robert, ever the stoic figure, said little. It was as though the whole family had silently agreed to pretend that life could go on, that the pain would fade. But it didn't. Sophie's heart hardened after that, as though it had learned that love came with a heavy cost. She threw herself into her studies, burying her emotions beneath layers of books, assignments, and work. The pain of loss became something she kept hidden, tucked away beneath the surface. She learned to numb it, to push it aside. But the truth was, the loss of Ethan never truly left her. It followed her into adulthood like a shadow, a reminder that life could take everything away in an instant. As she grew older, Sophie kept her distance from romantic relationships. The fear of losing someone else was too great, too overwhelming. Instead, she focused on building her career, becoming someone her father would be proud of. She climbed the corporate ladder, taking on roles that required everything of her time, her energy, and her soul. At first, it felt like success. But the deeper she got into her work, the more she realized something was missing. Sophie had built a life that was impressive on the outside, stable, successful, efficient, but on the inside, she felt empty. She had lost touch with herself. Her friendships, though cherished, felt more like obligations than sources of joy. Emma, her best friend since college, was one of the few people who had stuck by her. Emma had always been the opposite of Sophie, spontaneous, fun-loving, and unapologetically herself. Sophie admired Emma's carefree attitude, her ability to laugh off the little things and focus on what truly mattered: people, connection, and joy. But even with Emma, Sophie felt like an outsider in her own life. She didn't know how to let go, to stop worrying about everything that could go wrong. She lived in constant fear that she wasn't good enough, that she wasn't doing enough. And then came the diagnosis. Sophie had been living her life in autopilot, managing the chaos of work, relationships, and unspoken expectations. She had been so focused on surviving, on keeping everything together, that she had never really lived, not fully, not without the weight of fear and perfectionism hanging over her every move. Now, with the doctor's words still echoing in her ears, Sophie had to confront everything she had been avoiding for so long: the people she loved, the choices she had made, the pain she had buried. But most of all, she had to face herself. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a message from Emma. "I'm here for you, Sophie. No matter what." Sophie stared at the message, her finger hovering over the screen. There was so much she wanted to say, but she couldn't. Not yet. Instead, she typed a simple response. "Thanks, I need to think." She set the phone down and took a long, steadying breath. The weight of her situation hadn't fully sunk in, but one thing was clear: her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet understand. And for the first time in years, Sophie wasn't sure if she was ready. The next few days felt like a blur for Sophie. She had no idea how to manage the cacophony of emotions crashing through her. The doctor's words still rang in her ears every moment of the day, and, even at night, they haunted her dreams. A few weeks left. That was all she had now. What had once seemed like a well-planned life had unraveled into chaos. Sophie had spent years building her career in the fast-paced world of corporate law, often burying her personal life beneath layers of responsibilities. Now, it felt like all that work, all the hours spent stressing over deadlines and making deals, meant nothing. No amount of success could save her now. The hardest part was the loneliness. Sophie had always been surrounded by people, coworkers, acquaintances, distant friends. But now, in the quiet of her apartment, surrounded by empty rooms and the sterile hum of city noise outside, she realized just how isolated she truly felt. She had no one to share this with. No one who truly understood her, at least not in the way she needed. And then there was Emma. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from her best friend. Sophie hesitated before picking up. "Hey," she said softly, trying to mask the weight in her voice. "Sophie, you there? It's been days, and I haven't heard from you. What's going on?" Emma's voice was laced with concern, but Sophie could hear the underlying frustration. Emma always had a way of cutting straight to the point. Sophie shifted uncomfortably on the couch, avoiding the question. "I've just been busy, work stuff." She wasn't ready to tell Emma the truth, not yet. It felt like too much of an impossible burden to drop on her best friend all at once. "Busy? Sophie, you're avoiding me. What's really going on? You're not the same lately." Emma's voice softened, the edge of her frustration replaced by genuine worry. "Tell me what's wrong." Sophie closed her eyes and let out a slow breath. She wanted to say something. She wanted to reach out, to explain it all, to scream that everything was falling apart. But she couldn't. Not yet. I don't know, Em. I just need some time to think. I'll call you later, okay?" Sophie could hear the lie in her own voice. She wasn't giving Emma anything real. It was like putting up a wall, one she wasn't sure she could tear down. "Fine," Emma said, a slight quiver in her voice. "But don't shut me out. I'm here, always." Sophie ended the call before Emma could say anything more. The words hung in the air between them, unresolved and heavy. She hated herself for pushing Emma away. But the truth was, Sophie wasn't ready to confront the reality of what she was facing, let alone explain it to someone else. The days that followed were a blend of painful clarity and bitter denial. Sophie tried to go about her routine as normal. She went to work, though everything felt dull and meaningless. She attended meetings, nodded along to conversations, but in her mind, all she could hear was the ticking clock, the countdown to something she couldn't avoid. Her boss, Mr. Bradford, barely noticed the change. Sophie had always been the reliable one, the one who got things done without complaint. Her personal life had never been a topic of conversation, and it had always stayed that way until now. But as the days dragged on, something started to shift. Sophie couldn't keep ignoring the truth. The fear was starting to take over, and with it, something more profound, a deep, gnawing emptiness. She couldn't focus. She couldn't stop thinking about the life she hadn't lived, the relationships she had neglected, the experiences she had always put off for later. Now, later had arrived, and there was no more time. At night, Sophie would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of her life with a new sense of urgency. Why hadn't she been more present? Why had she waited so long to truly live? The regret began to pile up, each passing minute adding weight to her heart. The first real fracture in Sophie's carefully constructed world came a week later. Sophie had been at work late, her mind a jumble of deadlines and emails, when Rachel, her colleague and one of the few people she considered a friend, stopped by her office. "You okay, Sophie?" Rachel asked, standing in the doorway with a concerned look on her face. She was one of those people who always seemed to be in control, but Sophie could see the worry behind her eyes. Sophie forced a smile, rubbing her temple. "Yeah, just tired. A lot on my plate." Rachel stepped inside, crossing her arms. "I've been hearing a lot of murmurs around the office lately. People are starting to notice you've been distant. If you need help, you can always ask, right?" Sophie couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Rachel was kind, always offering a helping hand, but Sophie wasn't sure if she could accept it. She wasn't ready to share the truth with anyone, not yet. "I'm fine," Sophie said, her voice a little too sharp. "I don't need help. Just need to get through this week." She could feel the walls going up again, each word pushing Rachel further away. But Rachel wasn't deterred. She took a step closer. "Sophie, I don't want to be nosy, but I can tell something's off. You've been different. Are you sure everything's okay?" Sophie's heart raced, and for a split second, she almost told her. She almost let the words slip. "I'm dying." But the fear of letting someone in, of showing vulnerability, gripped her. She clenched her fists, trying to hold back the surge of emotion that threatened to break free. "I just need some time to sort things out, Rachel," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I appreciate you checking in, but I'll be okay." "Really?" Rachel looked unconvinced, but she didn't press further. She gave Sophie a nod before leaving the room, but Sophie could see the doubt in her eyes. As the door closed behind Rachel, Sophie let out a long, shaky breath. She had just pushed away another person who cared about her. She couldn't help but wonder if she would ever truly allow herself to be seen again, to let someone in. The weeks felt like they were slipping through Sophie's fingers. And yet, despite the gnawing tension, despite the ever-present fear that whispered in her ear, there was a small part of her that still believed she could fix it, that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to redeem herself before it was too late. But with each passing day, the truth grew harder to ignore. Sophie's routine had been shattered in ways she never imagined. Every day felt like she was drifting further away from the life she'd meticulously crafted. But amidst all the chaos, something began to stir deep within her. The realization of her mortality, which had once felt paralyzing, slowly transformed into a strange, unsettling clarity. She started to ask herself questions she had avoided for years. What had her life really been about? Was it just a series of empty achievements? Was she living or just existing? A week after the conversation with Rachel, Sophie made a decision, a small but significant one. She left her apartment. She had been so consumed by her own thoughts, locked in her sterile space, that she had forgotten what it was like to simply live outside of herself. The first step was the most difficult. Sophie hadn't been to a park in years. The last time she went for a walk, it was with Ethan before he was gone. The memories were so vivid, so painful, that she had intentionally avoided the places they used to go. But now it seemed like the only place that might bring her any sense of peace. She put on a pair of comfortable sneakers, a simple jacket, and walked out the door. The crisp morning air felt like a shock to her system. She hadn't realized how much time she had spent cooped up inside, wrapped in the cocoon of her own mind. The park was quiet, serene. The gentle rustling of the trees and the distant chirping of birds made Sophie feel like she was stepping into a different world, one where time moved slower and the hustle of life could be left behind for a while. She walked along the path, her thoughts swirling, her mind racing with 1,000 different emotions. As she passed the old oak tree, the one she and Ethan had once carved their initials into, Sophie stopped. Her heart thudded in her chest. The memory of that day flooded her, and for the first time in years, tears began to well up in her eyes. Sophie sank onto the nearby bench, her hands trembling as she wiped away the tears. She hadn't cried like this in a long time. She had buried all of it, the grief, the pain, the loss deep inside, like a box she was afraid to open. But now the floodgates had been opened, and she couldn't stop the tears from flowing. It wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about everything she had pushed aside. Her fear of death had robbed her of the joy of living. She had been so focused on the ticking clock that she forgot to live in the moments that mattered. Sophie had allowed herself to be consumed by regret, by the what-ifs that haunted her every step. As she sat there, staring at the etched initials on the tree, she realized something profound. The love she had with Ethan, the time they shared, wasn't gone. It wasn't erased by his death. It was part of her now. It had shaped who she was, who she had become. Sophie couldn't undo the past, but she could choose how to carry it moving forward. In that moment, something shifted inside her. She didn't have to spend the rest of her days wallowing in grief or chasing after the perfect life. She could find peace in the here and now. After several minutes, Sophie stood up, wiping her eyes. She took a deep breath and decided to walk back home, but this time, she didn't feel the crushing weight of regret on her shoulders. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie allowed herself to just be no plans, no expectations, just a woman reclaiming her space in the world. The next morning, Sophie woke up with a new sense of purpose. She was no longer going to let fear control her life. It was time to start living fully, even with the little time she had left. She wasn't going to wait for a perfect moment. She had spent her whole life striving for perfection, and look where that had gotten her. Sophie got dressed quickly, feeling an unfamiliar rush of excitement. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do yet, but she knew it was time to stop being a bystander in her own life. Sophie took a deep breath, the weight lifting slightly from her chest. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could still find peace in the time she had left. Sophie's journey had only just begun, but one thing was clear: she wasn't going to face it alone. Sophie sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of the coffee cup in her hands, though her mind was 1,000 miles away. The words had finally escaped her, and Emma had reacted with nothing but love and support, but Sophie still couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing control of her own life. She wasn't afraid of dying. She had made peace with that. What terrified her more than anything was how much time she had wasted, how much she had never said, how much she had never truly experienced. They sat in silence for a few moments, the background noise of the cafe muffling the heavy tension between them. Emma, ever the listener, seemed to understand that Sophie needed a moment to collect herself. But as Sophie's gaze wandered out the window, she felt something stir deep within her, an overwhelming flood of realization and regret. "I've been living in the wrong direction, Sophie said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been chasing all these things: success, achievements, approval, because I thought they would make me happy. But they didn't. I never let myself be happy. I was too afraid to truly live." Emma took a deep breath, nodding, her eyes reflecting the weight of what Sophie had just said. "You were always running, sophomore. But you were never running toward anything. You were just running away from the fear of not being enough. But I've always known, even from the outside, that you were enough. You don't need any of those other things to define you." Sophie's chest tightened. Emma's words were like a balm to a wound Sophie had carried for years. They were true, and yet they were so hard to accept. "I don't know if I have enough time to change," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can fix all the things I've broken." Emma reached out, gently placing her hand over Sophie's. "You can't fix everything, Sophie. And that's okay. You can't change the past, but you can change how you face the future. You still have time to make things right, to say the things you've left unsaid, to love the people you've neglected." Sophie's mind raced as she processed Emma's words. For the first time, she truly understood the depth of her own isolation. She hadn't just avoided the world around her, she had avoided herself. But now, in this moment, she had a choice. She could either continue to live in the shadow of regret, or she could step into the light, even if it was just for a little while. "What about the things I never did?" Sophie asked, a sense of urgency creeping into her voice. "The dreams I had, the places I wanted to go, the life I wanted to live. It's too late for me now." "No, it's not too late," Emma said firmly, her voice unwavering. "You've spent your whole life building walls around yourself, Sophie. Maybe the real journey you need to take is the one that's not about fixing the past, but about finding peace in the present. You can't undo the time you've lost, but you can still make something beautiful out of what's left." Sophie felt a shiver run through her. Emma was right. Sophie had been so focused on the future and the things she thought she should achieve that she had forgotten to savor the present. It wasn't about doing everything she had missed out on, it was about making peace with who she was now and learning to be kind to herself, to finally live in the moments she still had. As the conversation between Sophie and Emma deepened, Sophie began to realize that maybe she didn't need to climb the metaphorical mountain she'd always dreamed of. Maybe, just maybe, the journey she needed wasn't about achieving more but about discovering the beauty in the simple, quiet moments. In the past few days, she had already taken steps toward reclaiming her life, small, significant steps that, though filled with pain, were starting to feel like the beginning of something beautiful. Emma smiled softly, reaching for her phone. "You know," she said, "there's a concert in the park next weekend. It's nothing fancy, just a small jazz band. You've always loved music like that." Sophie blinked in surprise. "I can't believe you remember that. I haven't thought about that kind of thing in years." "Well," Emma said, her voice teasing, "it's about time you let yourself remember." Sophie chuckled, the sound of her own laughter foreign but strangely comforting. "Jazz in the park, huh? That sounds like something I could actually do." "Exactly. And I'll be there. We can just enjoy it together, no expectations. No pressure. Just a day for you, Sophie. A day to live." Sophie looked down at the cup in her hands, feeling the tears pricking her eyes once more. This was it. This was the moment when everything began to change, not because she was suddenly going to conquer the world, but because she was finally going to stop running away from it. She hadn't thought she could ever allow herself to enjoy the small, imperfect moments in life again, but as Emma smiled at her across the table, Sophie realized something she hadn't in a long time. She had the power to choose. To choose how she faced each day, no matter how limited it was. To choose to find peace in the messiness of it all. Sophie left the cafe that afternoon with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The heaviness in her chest had eased slightly, and for the first time since the diagnosis, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was all she had left, a handful of days, a handful of moments, but those moments, however fleeting, were hers to shape. She didn't need to make up for lost time. She didn't need to chase after impossible dreams. Sophie had a new understanding. What mattered was how she spent the time she had left, not how much of it she could cram into the days ahead. As Sophie walked through the streets of her city, the world felt different. More vibrant, more alive. It was as if the world had been holding its breath, waiting for her to breathe again. And for the first time, Sophie allowed herself to breathe deeply, filling her lungs with the air she had been avoiding for so long. She didn't know what the future held, but she finally understood that it wasn't about controlling it. It was about embracing whatever came next, whether it was laughter, tears, or the quiet peace of a day spent listening to music in the park. And as she looked ahead, Sophie realized that even if the road was short, it was still hers to walk. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Sophie is starting to embrace life again, one moment at a time. What's one thing you've always wanted to do, but kept putting off? Don't wait for tomorrow, live today. The days that followed Sophie's conversation with Emma felt different, lighter, though the weight of her diagnosis still hung over her like a shadow. But it wasn't a dark, oppressive shadow anymore. It had become a part of the landscape of her life, something she no longer feared, but something she accepted. Sophie didn't know if she had months or weeks left. She didn't know if her body would fail her in the next few days, or if she would have just a little more time. But she did know one thing: she wasn't going to waste another second. For the first time in ages, Sophie allowed herself to live with intention. She went to the concert with Emma, and for 2 hours, they sat in the park, basking in the glow of the setting sun, listening to the soft, melodic rhythms of the jazz band. It wasn't the grand adventure she had once dreamed of, but it was perfect. The sounds, the laughter, the moments shared with a friend. This was living. They walked home that evening, their conversation easy and natural, as if they had always been this close, as if Sophie hadn't spent so many years running away from everything that mattered. Sophie continued to take small steps in reclaiming her life. She reconnected with other friends she had distanced herself from. She took long walks in the park, each time feeling a little more grounded, a little more present. She spent time with her family, making up for lost moments. She talked to her parents about things she had never shared, memories from her childhood, fears she'd kept locked away. The words flowed freely now, no longer restrained by the belief that she had no time left to care about these relationships. One day, Sophie sat down and wrote a letter. It wasn't to anyone in particular. It was to herself. She wrote about her regrets, her triumphs, the pain she had carried for so long, and the peace she had begun to find. Dear Sophie, I've spent so much of my life thinking that I had to get everything right, that I had to keep moving, to keep achieving, to keep proving myself. But I've learned something in these last few weeks. I've learned that it's not about being perfect, it's about being present. It's about living, not just existing. And that's what I want you to remember. Don't be afraid to love. Don't be afraid to feel. Don't be afraid to let go of the things that no longer serve you, and don't hold on to the things that hurt you. Life is precious, even if it's short. I wish I had realized that sooner, but I'm glad I know it now. There's still so much beauty in the world, and I'll take every moment I have left to witness it. Sophie. Sophie hadn't planned to share the letter with anyone. It was a personal reflection, an acknowledgement of the person she had been and the woman she was becoming. But as she held the letter in her hands, she realized that it wasn't just for her. It was for anyone who needed to hear her story, anyone who had spent too much time chasing things that didn't matter. She shared the letter with Emma, and soon, it was shared with others, too. The message was simple, but it was something Sophie needed to hear herself, and something she hoped would resonate with others. It's never too late to start living. Don't wait until you're staring at the end to finally see the beauty in your life. It wasn't long after that Sophie found herself sitting in a small cafe again, the same one where she had shared the news of her diagnosis with Emma. This time, she was there with her parents. The conversation was light, filled with laughter, but there was an underlying tension, one that Sophie could sense, but couldn't quite name. Her mother, always the strong one, kept her emotions in check, though Sophie could see the quiet pain in her eyes. Her father, too, wore a mask of stoic strength, but his hands were slightly trembling as he stirred his coffee. Sophie had never truly noticed how much her parents had sacrificed for her. She had always been so focused on her own life, her own struggles, that she had never fully appreciated the love they had poured into her. Now, in this moment, she saw them with new eyes. She saw the exhaustion in their faces, the years of worry and care they had put into raising her. She saw that they, too, had carried their own burdens. Sophie reached across the table, her hand finding her mother's. Her mother looked at her, startled, but then smiled softly, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. I don't know how to say this, Sophie began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. But I need you to know how much I love you both. And I need you to know that I'm okay. I'm at peace. Her mother squeezed her hand, her voice breaking as she whispered, Sophie, you've always been our greatest joy. We just wish we could take this pain away for you. Sophie smiled, feeling the weight in her chest lift just a little. I know, Mom. I know. But the truth is, I've spent too much of my life running from everything, from you, from myself. And now I see what I've been missing. I don't need to be fixed. I just need to be here. With you. Her father nodded, his voice quiet but filled with strength. We love you, Sophie. And we're so proud of you. You've always been strong, even when you didn't know it. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes, but she didn't try to hide them. She didn't need to. She had given herself permission to feel the love, the pain, and the beauty of this moment. And that was enough. Sophie spent the following weeks in a state of calm. The fear that once ruled her life had lessened, replaced by a quiet acceptance. She continued to spend time with the people she loved, making new memories, savoring the simplest of moments. She didn't know when her time would come, but she had finally come to terms with it. It was one evening, as Sophie sat in her living room, looking out the window at the twilight sky, that she finally understood the lesson she had been avoiding for so long. Life was short, too short to waste on regret. And although she couldn't undo the past, she could choose how to spend her remaining days. And that, Sophie realized, was the greatest gift of all. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophie whispered to herself, "I'm okay." And for the first time in her life, she truly meant it. The days following Sophie's final reflections felt peaceful, almost too serene for someone who had been living with the burden of an uncertain future for so long. Every day, Sophie took it as it came, living fully, loving fiercely, and embracing the small, beautiful moments life still had to offer. She had learned to appreciate the quiet moments of everyday life. The way the sunlight streamed through the curtains in the morning, the sound of her mother's voice when she called to check in, the laughter shared with Emma over coffee. But one afternoon, everything changed. Sophie was walking through the local park, her favorite spot, a place she had visited countless times in the past. It was a warm, golden afternoon, the kind where the world seemed to slow down, the air was soft, and even the birds seemed to chirp with a sense of tranquility. She was alone, her hands tucked in the pockets of her jacket, enjoying the serenity of the moment. For a long time, Sophie had avoided this kind of stillness, always distracted, always looking ahead. But now she welcomed it with open arms. As she passed the park bench where she had sat with Emma just days before, Sophie spotted someone she hadn't expected to see. Standing by a small fountain, a familiar face turned toward her. The realization hit her like a jolt of electricity. It was Liam. Liam. The one that got away. She hadn't seen him in years, since that summer when everything had changed. When their relationship had ended, leaving her with a whirlwind of emotions that she never fully processed. Liam had been a chapter of her life she had never quite closed, and seeing him now, out of nowhere, felt like the universe was pushing her to face something she had long avoided. Liam caught her gaze, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. His expression was a mix of surprise and something softer, nostalgia, maybe, but as quickly as it appeared, it faded, replaced by a quiet wariness. Sophie couldn't help but feel the rush of old emotions stir inside her. The confusion, the pain, and yet, a strange sense of unfinished business. Her heart raced as she approached him, unsure of what she would say. Sophie had long convinced herself that she had let go of their past. After all, it had been years. But seeing him now brought back the flood of memories, some painful, some sweet. The summer nights spent talking for hours, the laughter, the dreams they had shared, and then the silence when everything fell apart. Sophie had moved on in the sense that she had healed, but had she truly forgiven him? Had she forgiven herself? Liam, Sophie said softly, almost unsure if the name sounded right on her lips anymore. He blinked, as if pulled out of his own thoughts, and then smiled, a small, cautious smile. "Sophie, I didn't expect to see you here." Sophie returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, same. I didn't know you still came to this park." "I didn't either," Liam said, his voice soft. "But it's good to be here. It feels different, doesn't it?" She nodded, feeling the weight of his words. Different. That was an understatement. Everything felt different now. Their lives, their selves, the paths they had taken, all of it had changed. Sophie found herself standing before him, a woman transformed in so many ways, but still caught in the ghosts of their past. "I never thought we'd cross paths again," Sophie said, her voice steady, though her heart was beating louder than she would have liked. It's been a long time. Yeah, it really has, Liam replied. But maybe some things are meant to come full circle. Sophie paused, feeling the tension in the air between them. Some things are meant to come full circle. She wanted to say something profound, something that would make sense of everything, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she settled for honesty, something she had been learning to embrace. I've spent so many years thinking about our time together, she said quietly, looking away for a moment to collect her thoughts. Wondering what went wrong. But I think I was too scared to face it. I was scared to face the truth about us. Liam nodded, a slight sadness in his eyes. I know. I think I was scared, too. Scared of admitting that I didn't know how to love you the way you deserved. Sophie felt a small pang in her chest, but it wasn't anger, not like it used to be. It was something else, understanding, maybe even compassion. I never blamed you, Liam, she said softly. Not really. I blamed myself for not being enough. For not being strong enough to keep things together. You were more than enough, Sophie, Liam said quickly, his voice urgent, like he needed her to hear him. I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready for you, for what we had. But that doesn't mean I didn't care. I did. I still do. Sophie's heart ached, but there was something in his voice, something so genuine, that it made the past feel a little less bitter. Did he still care? Why now, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why after all these years? Liam hesitated, as though he was choosing his words carefully. I've been thinking about the past a lot, too. And I realized something important. Life is too short to let things go unsaid, Sophie. To let things end without trying to fix them. I don't know if I'll get another chance to tell you this, but I wanted you to know, if nothing else, I'm sorry. The sincerity in his words hit Sophie harder than she expected. She had been waiting for an apology like this for years, but now that it was here, it didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders. She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew this. She was ready to let go. Ready to release the grip of the past that had been holding her captive. I'm sorry too, Sophie whispered, for not letting go sooner. For holding on to things that only hurt me. Liam gave her a soft, knowing smile, the kind that spoke volumes without saying a word. Maybe it's time for both of us to move forward, he said gently. Sophie nodded, her heart strangely light. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to dwell on what had been lost. Instead, she felt a quiet peace. One that she hadn't known was possible until this moment. They didn't need to fix everything. They didn't need to revisit the past again. They only needed to acknowledge it, and then, together, let it go. Maybe it is, she said. As Sophie walked away from the park that afternoon, she felt a sense of release that she hadn't realized she was carrying. The past, once so heavy, now felt lighter. Sophie hadn't expected a chance encounter with Liam to change everything, but it did. It didn't undo the hurt, and it didn't erase the mistakes, but it gave her something much more powerful, the freedom to forgive. The days that followed Sophie's unexpected encounter with Liam were filled with a quiet kind of joy. It was as though a heavy fog had lifted from her heart, leaving her able to see the world in a different light. For years, she had been running from the past, whether consciously or unconsciously, and now, after letting go of those old wounds, Sophie felt the freedom to embrace the future. Her conversations with Emma had shifted too. They no longer circled around Sophie's illness or the shadows of fear that once hung over them. Instead, they talked about possibilities. About what Sophie might want to do in the coming weeks and months. About things that could bring joy and fulfillment, no matter how much time she had left. I've always wanted to see the ocean at sunrise, Sophie told Emma one afternoon as they sat on the porch, sipping iced tea. I think I should do it. I need to see the sun rise over the ocean, feel that vastness. The horizon. Emma raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. You're serious? Yeah, Sophie said, a smile tugging at her lips. It's been on my mind for years. And now I don't have any more excuses. There was a moment of silence as Emma absorbed Sophie's words, and then her face softened with understanding. You know what? Let's do it. We'll go on a road trip. I'll drive. We'll find the perfect spot and watch that sunrise together. Sophie's heart swelled with gratitude. She hadn't expected such an offer, but it meant more to her than she could express. Emma had always been the kind of friend who was there for every big moment and every small one. But this felt different. It felt like Emma was giving Sophie a gift, one that would stay with her no matter what happened in the future. Thank you, Emma, Sophie whispered, blinking back tears. This means everything to me. Emma smiled brightly, her eyes twinkling. We've got this, Sophie. Let's make some memories. In the days leading up to their trip, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about the ocean. It wasn't just the idea of seeing the sunrise, it was the idea of taking that leap. Of finally doing something that she had always pushed aside. She had lived her life in cautious steps, always second-guessing herself, always making sure to play it safe. But now everything had changed. Sophie had realized that she didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to be prepared for everything. She only needed to live. The morning of the trip arrived, and Sophie woke early, excitement bubbling in her chest. It was still dark outside, and as she packed her bag, she found herself feeling nervous in the way you feel when you're about to do something big, something that might change everything. The thought of seeing the ocean, this vast, unending stretch of water, felt like a metaphor for her life right now. It was unknown, it was wild, but it was also beautiful and full of promise. Emma arrived at her door, a bright smile on her face, her hair pulled into a messy bun. Are you ready for this? She asked, practically bouncing on her heels. Sophie nodded, a laugh escaping her lips. I've never been more ready. The road trip took them through winding highways, rolling hills, and small towns that seemed frozen in time. They talked about everything and nothing, the miles stretching out in front of them like a blank canvas. Sophie felt the weight of her diagnosis fall away as they drove. It was just her and Emma, the open road, and the promise of something new on the horizon. When they finally arrived at the beach, it was still dark. The air was cool, and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing. Sophie and Emma walked along the edge of the water, their feet sinking into the sand as they found the perfect spot to settle down. Look at that sky, Emma said, pointing to the horizon. It was just beginning to lighten, the stars fading away to make room for the first light of day. Sophie smiled, feeling a sense of awe wash over her. It was a sight she had imagined for so long, and now it was finally real. I've never seen anything like it, Sophie whispered, her voice filled with wonder. They sat in silence as the sky slowly turned from dark to soft hues of pink and gold, and the sun finally began to rise. The moment was so breathtakingly beautiful that it felt like time itself had paused. Sophie's heart swelled with emotion, knowing that this was a memory she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She had made it here. She had stepped out of her comfort zone and taken the leap, and it had been worth every second. For a long while, they sat together, watching the waves and the sky, talking softly about life and the future. The world felt big and small all at once, and Sophie realized something important. It wasn't about the number of days she had left. It was about the experiences she could have, the moments she could savor. It was about truly living. The drive back home felt different. Sophie wasn't just driving back to her routine, back to her life with the diagnosis hanging over her. She was driving back with a new sense of purpose. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't afraid of the unknown or of the future. She had made the choice to embrace each day, to take each moment as it came, and to seek out the joy that had always been available to her, even in the darkest times. As they pulled into the driveway, Sophie turned to Emma, a smile spreading across her face. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for this. For everything. Emma reached over and squeezed her hand. Anytime, Sophie. You're my best friend. And we're in this together. Sophie nodded, feeling the weight of her gratitude. She knew that she was surrounded by people who loved her, who supported her. And that made all the difference. She didn't need to know what would happen in the coming months or years. What mattered was that she was living fully, taking chances, and making memories. As Sophie walked into her house, she felt the familiar warmth of home surrounding her, but this time, it was different. It wasn't a place she had been hiding in. It was a place where she could rest, recharge, and continue her journey. She was ready for whatever came next. The weeks following Sophie's trip to the beach passed quickly. She had returned home with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face the future, no matter what it might hold. It felt as though she had crossed some invisible line into a life where, though she still carried the weight of her diagnosis, she was no longer bound by fear. The diagnosis didn't define her anymore. She had let go of the notion that she had to wait for the end, constantly dreading the next doctor's visit or the next round of tests. But there was one final step Sophie had yet to take. As much as Sophie felt alive and free, she still hadn't confronted the one thing that had haunted her most, the unknown. The part of her that still felt like time was slipping away, that she had to make the most of every moment, even if it wasn't realistic. But what did making the most of the time left even mean? Sophie spent hours reflecting on this, often in the quiet of the evening, after Emma had gone home. She thought about the life she still wanted to live, the dreams she hadn't chased yet, and the people she had yet to make peace with. One person, in particular, lingered in her mind, the one person who had always been the closest, the one who had been there since day one, her mother, Linda. Their relationship had been a complicated one. Sophie loved her mother dearly, but their dynamic had always been strained by unspoken expectations. Linda had always been the practical one, the caretaker, while Sophie had lived in the shadow of illness and uncertainty. The constant tension had left Sophie with a sense of distance, and though she knew her mother loved her, Sophie had never felt like they had the kind of relationship she craved, one built on true connection, understanding, and honesty. The last time Sophie saw her mother, they'd shared a quiet dinner together, but something had felled off. There had been a moment, a brief, flickering pause in conversation when Sophie had felt that familiar divide, like there were things they were both afraid to talk about. Sophie had always been afraid of disappointing her mother, of not living up to the expectations she had set for her. But now, Sophie realized something. She was more than her diagnosis. And her mother deserved to see that, too. The next day, Sophie made the decision. She would face this final hurdle. She would speak to her mother, lay bare the feelings she had hidden for so long, and, most importantly, allow herself to be fully seen for who she was, not just as a daughter facing death, but as Sophie, a woman who had dreams, desires, and hopes for her future. That afternoon, Sophie called her mother. Her heart thudded in her chest as she listened to the phone ring, each second amplifying the weight of her decision. Linda answered on the third ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Hi, sweetie," Linda said, her tone soft. "How are you feeling?" "I'm good, Mom," Sophie replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Can I come over and talk for a bit?" There was a pause on the other end, followed by a gentle sigh. "Of course, honey. I'll make some tea. Come whenever you're ready." Sophie arrived at her mother's house an hour later, her hands slightly trembling as she walked up the familiar steps. It felt like stepping back in time, to the place where she had grown up, to a home filled with memories, both good and painful. She knocked on the door, and soon her mother appeared, her face lighting up when she saw Sophie standing there. Come in, Linda said, stepping aside to let her in. The familiar scent of freshly brewed tea filled the air, a comforting smell that took Sophie back to countless afternoons spent with her mother in this very room. They sat down at the kitchen table, steaming cups of tea between them. Sophie took a deep breath, looking at her mother with a mixture of love and fear. The silence stretched between them before Sophie finally spoke. "Mom, there's something I need to say." Linda looked up, her brow furrowing slightly, sensing the gravity of the conversation. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" Sophie hesitated for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. This was harder than she had anticipated. But she pushed forward, determined. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us. About everything. And I've realized that there's something I need you to know. Something I need you to understand." Linda set her cup down gently, her eyes locking onto Sophie's. "You know you can tell me anything, don't you?" Sophie nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I've always felt like I wasn't enough for you. That I was always a disappointment. I know you never meant to make me feel that way, but I've spent so much time believing that if I just tried harder, if I could be healthier, if I could be perfect, then maybe I'd be enough. But I can't do that anymore. I don't want to keep carrying that weight." Linda's expression softened, and she reached across the table, taking Sophie's hand in hers. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You were never a disappointment to me. Never. I'm just scared. I'm scared to lose you. I'm scared of what's coming, and I've tried to hold on to you so tightly that maybe I've pushed you away instead. I didn't mean for you to feel that way." Sophie felt the tears welling up in her eyes. This was the moment she had been waiting for, her mother's truth, her vulnerability, and her own release. She squeezed her mother's hand tightly, her heart swelling with the love that had always been there, but had been hidden under layers of fear and miscommunication. "I don't want to be perfect, Mom," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "I don't need to be. I just want to be myself. And I want you to be proud of who I am right now, not who I could have been or who I was supposed to be." Linda's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, they sat there in silence, just holding each other's hands. Sophie knew this conversation hadn't fixed everything. There would still be fear. There would still be moments of uncertainty and sadness. But for the first time, she felt a deep connection with her mother, one rooted in understanding, in truth, and in acceptance. Sophie had faced her fear. She had confronted the one person who had unknowingly shaped so much of her emotional world, and in doing so, had allowed herself to be free. There was no more need to prove herself. There was only the love between them, raw and real. The weeks following Sophie's heart-to-heart with her mother felt like a slow unfolding of peace. Her relationship with Linda, though not perfect, had shifted into a new phase, one built on mutual understanding, vulnerability, and, perhaps for the first time, true acceptance of each other as they were, not as they had expected each other to be. Sophie felt lighter. The weight that had hung over her, the anxiety about disappointing those she loved, seemed to dissipate with every passing day. She had let go of old insecurities and embraced the truth of who she was: flawed, fragile, but real. The conversations with Emma were filled with a new sense of freedom, as if Sophie had shed an invisible cloak of fear and her spirit could finally breathe. But as much as Sophie had found peace with her diagnosis and her relationships, there was still one more piece of her journey that awaited her. How would she spend the time she had left? This question had lingered in her mind since her trip to the beach with Emma. She knew that no matter how much time she had, it wouldn't be enough to do everything she wanted. The world was vast, and there were still places she had never been, books she hadn't read, and experiences she hadn't lived. But Sophie had also realized something crucial in her moments of reflection: she didn't need to rush. She didn't need to chase every dream to find meaning. The most profound moments were often the ones that arrived quietly, when she simply allowed herself to exist in the moment. So, Sophie made a decision. She wouldn't be chasing an endless list of adventures. Instead, she would focus on the things that truly mattered: the relationships she had, the love she gave and received, and the moments of peace she could create in her own heart. She called Emma one evening as she sat by the window, watching the sunset spill golden light over the backyard. The sky was streaked with soft colors, the same shades that had greeted her at the ocean that morning. Sophie had never appreciated the beauty of the world more than she did now. "Hey, Emma," Sophie began, her voice calm but filled with a quiet sense of purpose. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next. I've realized something important. I don't need to go on a whirlwind trip to every place I've ever dreamed of visiting. I don't need to fill every second with adventure. What I need is peace." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sophie could hear Emma breathing softly, as though she were reflecting on her words. "You're right," Emma replied finally, her voice full of understanding. "Peace is everything. And you've already made the most beautiful memories. You've shown us all how to live with grace and purpose, Sophie." Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "It's not just about the memories, Em. It's about how I live each day. I want to focus on the people I love, the things that bring me joy, no matter how big or small. I want to spend time in the quiet moments, the ones that make me feel connected to myself and to the world around me. That's enough. That's all I need." Emma's voice was soft and sincere when she spoke again. "You're already living with so much wisdom, Sophie. I'm so proud of you. And whatever comes, you'll be ready." The conversation drifted into comfortable silence, the kind that only best friends can share, a silence filled with understanding and love, without the need for words. Sophie had never felt more certain of her decision. She would find peace in the present moment, and that would be enough. Sophie spent the following weeks creating a rhythm in her life, a rhythm that wasn't about achieving, rushing, or fighting the inevitable. She took long walks through the park with Emma, visited her mother for tea, and spent quiet evenings reading books that had long been on her shelf, but never quite gotten the attention they deserved. She meditated each morning, letting her thoughts come and go like the breeze. She didn't push herself. She didn't force joy. It simply arrived, in the small moments, like when she watched a hummingbird flit by her window, or when she and Emma sat in the garden, sharing old stories and laughter. Sophie had learned to cherish the time she had, not by running toward the finish line, but by embracing the present with open arms. She was no longer concerned with how many years she had left. What mattered now was the depth of her connections, the peace she carried inside, and the beauty she saw in the world. One afternoon, Sophie and Emma were sitting in the living room, sipping tea, when Emma turned to her, her face filled with a quiet intensity. "You've taught me so much, Sophie, about living fully, without fear. I don't know how to thank you." Sophie looked at her, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You don't need to thank me, Em. We're in this together. We always have been." But Emma shook her head, her eyes serious. "No, Sophie. You've shown me how to love without holding back, how to face fear and find peace anyway. I'm going to carry that with me for the rest of my life. And I think, in a way, you've already given me a piece of your wisdom. I'll never forget it." Sophie felt a lump form in her throat, but she blinked it away, her eyes meeting Emma's. "And I'll never forget you, Em. You've been my rock, my friend. You've made me believe in love again. In myself. That's a gift, one I'll carry with me no matter what happens." It wasn't long after that conversation that Sophie decided to visit the hospital again. She hadn't gone in a while, and though the doctors had said there was little they could do to change her prognosis, she felt it was time to check in. This time, when she stepped into the sterile, white-walled room, she did so without fear. She had already made peace with the journey. It wasn't about what the doctors could do. It was about how she chose to live each and every moment. When the doctor entered, he looked at her with a serious expression, as if he expected her to ask the same old questions. But Sophie just smiled, her voice steady. "What's next?" The doctor blinked, taken aback. "Well, we'll continue with your treatment options. I don't need the details, Sophie interrupted gently. I just wanted to know, what does life look like from here? The doctor seemed to hesitate, then leaned back in his chair, his face softening. You've already made the most important choice, Sophie. It's about how you live the time you have left. You've found peace, and that's the greatest gift anyone could ask for. Sophie nodded, a wave of calm washing over her. She knew it was true. The most important part of her journey wasn't the number of days or months ahead. It was the love she had given, the love she had received, and the peace she had found within herself. She walked out of the hospital that day with no answers, but with something far more meaningful, an unshakable sense of peace. The days continued to drift by, each one blending into the next. Sophie had grown accustomed to this new way of living, quietly, purposefully, without the need to rush or push for more. It was as though the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders, and in its place, there was a peace she had never known before. Her time was finite, yes, but she no longer saw that as a limitation. Instead, she saw it as a precious gift, one to be cherished and savored in the smallest of moments. Sophie spent her time doing what made her feel truly alive. She laughed with Emma over cups of tea, she hugged her mother a little tighter with each visit, and she took long walks in the quiet of the early mornings, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. She had started writing letters to the people she loved, pouring her heart into words she knew they might one day read, long after she was gone. But there was one last thing Sophie wanted to do. One last gift she wanted to give. She had made peace with the fact that her time was limited. But there was still a part of her that wanted to leave something behind, a legacy that would live on, a reminder to those she loved that even in the face of life's greatest challenges, love always endures. So, Sophie began to plan. It wasn't some grand, extravagant gesture. It was simple. It was deeply personal. She wanted to create something tangible. Something that would remind those she left behind of the lessons she had learned, how to love fiercely, how to face fear with grace, and how to find peace in the most unlikely places. She began creating a scrapbook. Not just any scrapbook, but a collection of moments, photographs, memories, and pieces of her heart. She asked Emma to help her, and together, they scoured old photo albums, selecting pictures from Sophie's childhood, her teenage years, and the time they had spent together. They included little notes and quotes, moments that had shaped Sophie's life in one way or another. Sophie wrote about the times she had felt scared, but had pushed through, the days when her heart had been broken, but she had found healing, and the quiet moments when she had realized just how beautiful life truly was. The scrapbook was filled with these reflections, all the things Sophie wanted to be remembered for. In the evenings, Sophie would sit by the fire, sipping her tea, as Emma helped her piece everything together. There was laughter, and sometimes there were tears of joy, tears of sorrow, and tears of gratitude for the friendship that had seen them both through so much. It was during one of these quiet moments, as they carefully arranged a photo from the beach trip, that Sophie spoke again, her voice soft but certain. Do you ever think about what you'll leave behind? I don't mean the stuff, you know? The things. I mean, the moments, the love, the memories. Emma paused, her hands stilling for a moment as she looked up at Sophie. All the time. I think about the legacy I'll leave in the way I love people, in the way I help them, in the way I make them feel. And I think about you, Sophie. I think about the way you've taught me to embrace every moment, even the hard ones. That's your legacy. You've shown me how to live. Sophie smiled, the tears welling up in her eyes again. I'm so glad. That's what I hope. That when I'm gone, you'll remember me for the love I gave, not for the illness, not for the things I couldn't control. I want to be remembered for how I lived. Emma reached out, taking Sophie's hand in hers. You'll always be remembered that way, Sophie. Always. The scrapbook was finished just a few weeks later. Sophie wrapped it up carefully, tying it with a simple ribbon, and placed it on the small table next to her bed. She hadn't shared it with anyone yet, but she knew that when the time was right, she would. In the days that followed, Sophie found herself reflecting more and more on her life. She had truly lived in ways she never expected. Even though her body was tired and the illness that had once defined her life was now too much to ignore, Sophie was at peace. The fear that had once gripped her heart was gone. The pain was still there, but it no longer controlled her. It was just another part of her journey, one she had learned to walk with, not fight against. On one quiet afternoon, as Sophie sat by the window, watching the last few leaves fall from the trees in the front yard, Emma arrived with a cup of tea. She sat beside Sophie, both of them looking out at the peaceful scene outside, knowing that time was slipping away. Sophie had always loved the quiet moments like these, the ones that didn't need to be rushed, the ones that didn't need to be filled with grand declarations or plans. For Sophie, it was enough to simply be. Sophie turned to Emma, her heart full of gratitude. "I've had the best life, Em. Even with everything that's happened. And I'm so grateful for you. I'm grateful for everything. For the love, the laughter, and the lessons." Emma smiled, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm grateful for you, Sophie. You've taught me more about life than anyone ever could." Sophie took a deep breath, letting the weight of her words settle in. "I think that's the greatest gift we can give to each other, Em. To teach each other how to live, how to love, how to find meaning in the small things. That's the legacy I want to leave." As the evening drew on and the soft glow of twilight filled the room, Sophie felt a sense of completion. She had come full circle. She had lived with grace, courage, and love. And in doing so, she had created a legacy that would live on long after her. The legacy wasn't in the things she had accumulated or the trips she had taken. It was in the hearts of those she had touched, the love she had given and received, the quiet moments she had cherished, and the lessons she had passed on to the people she cared about the most. And that, Sophie realized, was enough. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Sophie's journey shows us that our legacy isn't defined by the years we have, but by the love and wisdom we share. What legacy do you hope to leave behind?